How are you?
Well, I can say in my old job, they would never let me sit next to a sign that said crisis. I had a whole team whose sole job was to avoid that happening.
It's kind of the word for now, though, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Who's been your favourite Chancellor of the 6 in the last 3 years?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, lovely to be here. And we can talk about anything over the next hour. So I'll just start by saying it used to be quite a kind of rare thing to be an ex-Chancellor. You go around going, yeah, I'm the ex-Chancellor, and there are only a couple around, like Gordon Brown and Anna Sterling before me. And now they're like, to a penny, and a bit like the currency they've been running. It's a bit devalued. But of them, well, it's a very good question, actually. There are a couple I really have not been that impressed by, but I will say two people. One, so Philip Hammond was my deputy when I was in opposition. I was a shadow chancellor for 5 years, which is not a job you actually want to do for 5 years because you're trying to get out of doing that job. And he was my deputy, and he was older than me, had been in politics longer than me. And when I was appointed, I was only 33 years old as shadow chancellor, and it was kind of hard for an older, more experienced man to be my deputy. But he never ever had a problem with it, and was really straightforwardly good about working with me. So I always have a big soft spot for him. And then I actually think Jeremy Hunt is doing a pretty good job at the moment in just kind of calming everyone down, steadying the ship, and that's having a real effect in things like mortgage rates. And so maybe the bookends then of the 6.
Who was your least favourite?
Well, there was a guy who crashed the economy in the autumn. And actually tried to tear up a lot of things that we had done, under a Conservative Prime Minister earlier. We'd say that OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, was something we created. And so, in politics, when you've left, you obviously have a sort of soft spot and a sort of parental care for the things that you created and you did, and you accept that lots of things are going to be changed or junked by your successors. But I had thought the OBR was kind of really entrenched, and no one would undermine it or sideline it. That was something I'd be able to say, yeah, I created that and that helped. So I was pretty personally annoyed, as well as I thought it was a bad thing for the country, when Kwasi Kwarteng said he was going to sideline it or not consult it. I'm pleased to say now no one's ever going to do that again.
Jeremy Hunt's been quite critical of the OBR forecasts.
Well, he is critical of. I mean, he's critical of the Brexit forecast, isn't he? I mean, that's. So this is quite interesting, which is, the Chancellor. The OBR does the forecast for what the economy is going to do. I mean, you just had David Smith talking earlier, didn't you, who I really highly rate. So the OBR does a forecast like that. And the government can say, look, we just don't accept the forecast. And that's perfectly allowed within the rules of the OBR. It used to be that the chancellors themselves did the forecast. So Gordon Brown would have done his own forecast, Nigel Lawson would have done his own forecast, and so on. Produced by the Treasury, not produced by them personally. But the temptation, you can make the numbers add up with really small little changes to things like the inflation forecast or what you think the VAT receipts are going to be, and it's really tempting. And when I was Shadow Chancellor, our argument was that towards the end of that Labour government, they were sort of tweaking the forecast, particularly during the financial crash, to avoid having to confront some of the big questions. So that was what the OBR does. Now, basic to their forecast is also a forecast of what happens to what Brexit's doing to the economy. And they say Brexit is making Britain quite a lot poorer than it would otherwise have been, something I personally agree with. And of course, it puts Jeremy Hunt in an difficult position because, by the way, he voted Remain and was a strong.
Remind us how you voted.
I definitely voted Remain, and
You've read the room well.
Well, I think that was 48% of the room.
Yeah, there you go. The other 52 is very quiet.
That turned out to be the problem with the referendum. got applause from just under half the room. Yeah, so, that's a kind of interesting problem, which is the government sort of formally accepts this forecast, which says that Brexit's doing damage to the British economy, but doesn't want to say so publicly. And of course, Rishi Sunak did vote for Brexit. Jeremy Hunt didn't. So there are these little contradictions, and I thought it was one of your colleagues in the profession, Beth Rigby, did a pretty good job actually of
very good.
pinning Jeremy Hunt down, saying, hold on, you can't say the OBR is a good thing and then just ignore a central bit of their maths, which is the Brexit effect. And I think that will, we'll hear more of that, although generally Brexit is a sort of is the word that, you don't hear in British politics.
Isn't that shifting though? Because you are seeing conversations, be it on LBC, be it on Breakfast, be it on 5 Live, be it anywhere, or at Sky, all the broadcasters, that public opinion is shifting towards it, that some better relationship needs to be established with the EU now, an economic relationship.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there's sort of two interesting things going on. So first of all, the country did obviously voted 52%, 48% to leave. Now, to my mind, the 52-48 is a close vote, which is a vote to leave the EU. After that result, I never, although it was, personally traumatic for me, and I thought a very bad decision, I never doubted we had to leave the EU. Mm-hmm. But I thought, 52% want to leave, but 48% want to remain, and therefore it's also a vote for a close relationship with Europe having left, like being in things like the single market, the customs union, which are not, that you could be outside the EU and in those things. And I thought it was a big mistake of the kind of hardline Brexiteers to go for broke, go for 100%, go for we're out and we don't want anything to do with it, because it's basically an unsustainable position. It's not supported by the country. And we will, over the next 10, 15 years, I think, end up in a closer relationship with Europe, but not in the EU. Whereas if they'd settled for, winning but not trying to rub the defeated's face in the ground, which is usually a lesson in history and indeed in a business negotiation, you don't want to walk away with the other side feeling they've got nothing out of it. So I think that was a mistake. I think there's another interesting thing, which is, no one really wants to talk about it. So the Conservative Party, even though 2/3 of Conservative MPs voted to remain, and even though more Conservative voters voted to remain than to leave, the Conservative Party obviously kind of came to a view Brexit was Brexit and so on. The Labour Party, a majority of whose supporters voted Brexit, even though the leaders didn't, although Jeremy Corbyn himself probably did, they started not to want to talk about Brexit because they thought, and Keir Starmer, if you had him here, would not want to talk about it at all because he thinks, although he's obviously a kind of ardent believer in our membership of the EU, he knows that might cause him trouble trying to win back these so-called red wall seats in the north. Result, the Labour Party doesn't talk about it. Dare I say it, Naga, I don't think the BBC has really talked about it. It was sort of basically accused of being part of a kind of Remainer elite. And right from the top of that organisation, there was a feeling maybe we now need to back off and just not talk about it. The CBI doesn't talk about it because it was seen as a Remainer organisation. The TUC won't talk about it. So there's been a sort of big conspiracy of silence, and I think you're right that is fraying now because you can't avoid the elephant in the room, which is our trade with Europe has collapsed. They were our biggest trading partner. If you have an export business, you've been massively hit. As anyone who's ever tried to order anything from the continent now knows, all those sort of customs forms and whatever. So and all of that is solvable without going back into the EU. And so and if you wanted like the one thing you could do in Britain, which is in the power of the politicians rather than being something else happening in the world like the Ukraine war, you could say let's have a closer trading relationship with Europe, and that would increase our GDP and make the economy stronger.
Is the Conservative Party going to talk about it in the run-up to the next election?
I would think absolutely not, no. Because the Conservative Party doesn't want to reopen the internal division on it, and I don't think the Labour Party is going to talk about it either. And you saw, if you really follow these things closely, there was the Sunday Times newspaper, which is, in my view, a pretty good newspaper, and, it's usually pretty well informed on a Sunday. it said last Sunday that the government was thinking of being a bit like Switzerland, which is outside the EU but has a closer relationship. And immediately it was denied by everyone. And then when you ask Labour people about it, and people, the Labour Party, obviously the Labour shadow cabinet now, many people think will be the cabinet, they get asked about it and they run a mile as well. So it is still this, it's the kind of the big thing that no one wants to talk about. And it's not really healthy in a democracy if you have this sort of big issue that people don't really want to address.
How many visits did you make to Jeremy Hunt ahead of the autumn statement?
I would say I want to sort of preserve some privacy.
I'm not asking you what you spoke about. I'm just asking how.
I saw him a couple of times. I think, he's someone I've known for a long time. We were in the cabinet together. And I think when I was Chancellor, I did speak to previous Chancellors because in the end, they're going to be people who have been there before, faced all these problems before. So I don't think I was the only former Chancellor that he reached out to. And I really wish him well. And I think the most important thing that he's done, it will seem a really small thing, but the Treasury Civil Service are really excellent people. There are about 1,000 Treasury Civil Servants. They're not the highest paid people in the country. And by the way, they're all people who probably could go and get a job in the city. And, they are, and they work incredibly hard. And some of the previous chancellors, between me and Jeremy, have been quite dismissive of them and rude to their face. And I've heard stories because I'm still friends with the civil servants. And, that to my mind is not acceptable. And by the way, it's also just stupid because how are you going to get anything out of these people if you're just rude to them? And of course they fire, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng fired the permanent secretary to the Treasury, the head of the Treasury. And what was nice about Jeremy Hunt was right from the beginning, he's sort of reached out and tried, and said, and been respectful and collegiate with the civil service. And when I've been to see him, you could see that with the civil servants around him, many of whom I know personally, and they're all, they enjoy working with him, and that therefore the Treasury's kind of you're getting the best out of the Treasury. Whereas I think in some of the recent years, when everyone's been blaming the Treasury, particularly the Brexiteers, they go, this Brexit thing's not working, and it must be the Treasury's fault. That has just meant that one of the big institutions of the state, which we all pay for and which is supposed to be work on our behalf, has not been operating at 100% capacity or ability.
What's your defence to newspaper headlines that say that Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement was effectively austerity 2.0?
Well, I'm not sure we should be defensive about that. So I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question. There's a basic fact, which is countries are only as rich as their economies. And the services that countries afford, whether it's the health service or the army or the police or whatever, it only reflects how rich that country is. And the richer you are, the more you can afford, and the poorer you are, the less you can afford. And after big crashes, like after the financial crisis, it was a complete illusion that Britain, which had been made very much poorer by that crash, was going to be able to just go on affording the same level of spending, and the debt would have gone up, and we would have had exactly what actually Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng faced, which is the bond market would have said, no, we're not going to lend you the money, Britain. And interest rates would have shot up, we'd have had a big crisis. That's not, by the way, all fanciful, A, because it did happen in Britain this year, and B, because when I was Chancellor, it was happening in lots of countries around us. It happened in Ireland, it happened in Spain, it happened in Italy, it happened in Greece, it happened, many European countries, it began to happen in France. So this was not, just completely made up. You have to, after a crash, after a bad economic period, there's a squeeze on public spending. And people will remember there was in the 90s, and there was in the 80s, and there was in the 70s. Dennis Healey, remember, famously, and Jim Callaghan tried to explain. So I would just say, it's not surprising when you got, we're probably in recession, and the world's considerably poorer than it was a couple of years ago, and we spent a huge amount of money on COVID, that you're going to have to squeeze spending. And the very fact that the Labour opposition agree, I think, or increase taxes, that's just what happens.
Let's bring this back to house building and what we're here to talk about. Loads of questions coming through. You can keep them coming through on Slido, by the way, and we will get a microphone around the room. Northern Powerhouse, your thing. Levelling up, something that was pitched widely by Boris Johnson. There are concerns now. There's this potential rebellion amongst Conservative MPs, around 50, when it comes to these house building targets, which looks like Rishi Sunak is rowing back from this 300,000 figure. Something we were talking about on the panel, that even 200,000, which may seem realistic, is actually probably unachievable. What is going to be done to solve this housing shortage?
I wish I had a good answer for you.
I'm not asking how you solve it. I'm asking what's going to be done to try to solve it. Because that's the issue.
I don't think anything is going to be done to try and solve it.
Well, that's depressing. Well, it is, isn't it?
So there's a very simple political problem, which is not unique to the Conservative Party. This is similar problems faced by the other political parties. People who already own a home are a concrete voter with a real who owns the home and wants to protect the views of the home and the local community and so on. The person who might buy a home in the future is a theoretical voter. It's someone who might go and move, you don't know who this family is, who might go and move into the new housing development at the end of the village or the end of the town. And politically, local councillors and members of parliament of all parties who support housing development in their constituencies, and I'm not talking here about the urban constituencies, I'm talking about rural or green belt commuter constituencies. MPs who support housing development or who don't fight campaigns against it or don't join the local campaign against it, get voted out. It's as simple as that. And I represented for almost 20 years absolutely classic green belt, commuter belt seat outside Manchester in Cheshire, around the towns of Knutsford, Wilmslow, Audley Edge. Lots of pressure on house building. It was the big issue locally. There were lots of local residents groups, community action groups, and so on. Now, I was lucky to have a large Conservative majority, and I felt passionately that we should be building more homes. And so I did not agree with these campaign groups, but it was really difficult, and it was very difficult for the local Conservative councillors who would often then be voted. So I'm just saying the dynamic is very strong locally against house building. And so the government has to, either the government's strong enough to sort of force through house building targets, put incredible pressure on local councils to meet those targets, or else they fall foul of various kind of penalties. Because if they don't do that, there is no way local communities and local councils will support house building. There
is a theory, though, amongst many people I've just spoken to, that Conservative councils will not push through any new house building ahead of the next election.
I think that, unfortunately, I'm not sure if it's going to be, not sure it's sort of as absolute as that, but there is just not the incentives on these. If I asked you to do something that would lead to you being kicked out of your job in the next few months, you wouldn't do it, right? And so a local Conservative councillor, by the way, true of a local Labour councillor, local Liberal Democrat councillor, will not support these developments.
They won't support the greater good.
Well, what they won't do is they will come up with a whole load of reasons which local communities come up with, which are, it's in the wrong place, it's not done in the style. We would support this housing development if it was prettier. We would love to have the housing development, but our local school, is not big enough. We'd love to support the housing development, but unfortunately the traffic on the local road would be too much. There's always a reason, right, you can find, which sounds reasonable, and the politician who gets up and says, I think local communities should be consulted about housing, gets a big round of applause. The net result of all of this over the last 50 years, since the 1990s, the last big period of house building was under Margaret Thatcher. Ever since then, there's been no political incentive. I mean, John Prescott, he used to go around saying how great it was that he was defending the Greenbelt and whatever. So it's not just a kind of Tory thing. Although he did say, the Greenbelt was a Labour policy and I'm going to build on it, which was not really what he meant. But that's a big problem with the incentives. And as a result, you get these, the only way to get house building done is to have these really, well, I'd say there are two things. First of all, you have these top-down targets, you impose them on councils, and there are really draconian penalties for councils that don't come up with local plans that have sufficient housing. That's the first kind of thing you do. And then the second thing is I know this sounds kind of, I don't mean this sort of trite, but you take good opportunity, you make the best of a crisis. Crisis, what crisis? Mm-hmm. It is true that immediately after the financial crash, when I became Chancellor in 2010, there was no building going on, no construction, and the country looked like it was, in real trouble economically. And then there was a sort of brief opening of the sort of, a brief sort of gap in the fence where you could go through, which was people could see that they needed to get the country building again. And for a brief period of a few years, because of the economic problems, they outweighed the kind of NIMBY concerns. And there was a big push and we had things like Help to Buy and the like, to kind of get house building going. We were able to change the planning laws so that councils that didn't have local plans, were heavily penalized financially. But that was because the country had just been in a really deep recession. Now, I would say, this room would know much better than me, and hopefully it's not going to come to pass. But if in a year's time or a year and a half's time, house building activity really has slowed because of the broader economic conditions, and you can then find the political alliance to say, let's go for building, let's get things underway. So use the crisis, use the recession to make the pro-building, pro-home building argument.
Do you think the Conservatives are going to win the next election?
I think probably not. I wouldn't say definitely not. I used to work, so I was like the photocopy boy in John Major's Downing Street in the mid-90s. And Tony Blair was the leader of the opposition. And everyone in the building, let alone the rest of the country, knew Tony Blair was going to win. It was very obvious from John Major downwards that we were going to lose the election. If you speak to Conservatives now, they don't think like that. They think we're probably going to lose, but it's not definite. And the reason why they think that is they do not think that Keir Starmer has sealed the deal with the British public. He might be very reassuring and safe, which is quite an important thing for an opposition leader to achieve, but he's not inspiring. People aren't excited about an incoming Labour government. If I asked everyone in this room, what's the Labour Party's economic policy or what's the Labour Party's education policy, none of us would be able to answer that question right now. And
because it said it won't lay anything out ahead of the manifesto. Yeah, but you could tell, I'm sure you remember, and I certainly remember, which is, you could tell in the run-up to the 97 general election, and I talk about the 97 because that was the last time Labour won from opposition. You could tell back then that things would be quite different under a Blair government, or Blair-Brown government. That they weren't spelling out all the details, and the journalists were asking them to spell out more detail, but they had things like class sizes are going to be smaller, hospital waiting lists are going to be shorter, and so on. So that, there was a kind of strong impression of what they were going to do. I'll make another point, which is, I think, a mistake that people are making at the moment in politics. Back then, the Labour Party said, we are for the consumers, not the producers, which was a big change for Labour, because Labour had always been the big industrial union party for the workers. And they didn't talk about teachers' pay or nurses' pay. They talked about class sizes, how long you had to wait in A&E, how many beds there'd be in the hospital, and so on. It was all about the users of these services. And now if you look at the political debate, I was listening to the Today programme this morning,
it's all about how much nurses are going to get paid. Now, I'm not saying that's not important for a nurse, but only 1 in 5 people work for the public sector. The other 4/5 are paying taxes, and they want to know what they're getting for this. They want to know, what am I getting when I go to hospital? What am I getting when I go to the classroom? Now, you can argue that well-paid nurses will help deliver a better health service, but that's not the argument you're really hearing. It's all about the interests of the public servants, which they've got perfectly legitimate claims on pay and so on. But it's not where most of the people watching, listening it's not relevant, it's not really relevant to their lives. And I think both political parties have got stuck into talking about inputs, nurses' pay, number of doctors employed in the health service, if you had a Tory on when you're interviewing, they're always saying, we've got X thousand more doctors, X thousand more nurses. Well, fine, but when I turn up to a hospital with my family, I want to know I'm going to get treated, I promise you, the political debate has changed. 20 years ago, it was all about what you got out of the public services, right? My kid is going to learn to read and write in school. There's going to be an hour a day for reading and writing. Now the debate is all about, teachers' pay so I just think all the politicians have ended up talking about the producers, not the consumers. And obviously, you've got to have the producers lead to a better product for the consumers, and the gap is open for which political party or which politician can say, look, what I'm really talking to you about is what you get when you go to a hospital, what you get when you send your child to a school.
And you only get if they're there.
Sure, but then make that argument. But that's not, I heard the leader of the Royal College of Nurses this morning on the radio, and I was just like, you're about to go on strike, and I haven't heard one reason why, as a user of the NHS, this is going to be of any good to me other than like a massive potential inconvenience, And, I want this big pay rise when almost everyone in the private sector is taking a pay cut at the moment or getting half, and certainly not getting inflation-linked pay. They're not really explaining all that. It's my observation that the last really effective Labour opposition, which are carrying all the history of being the trade union party, actually did a very good job at saying we're not saying that's not an important issue, but we want to talk to you about what matters to you.
Greg sent something through Slido. He says, your 2015 policy has caused a huge drop in supply and much higher rents. Was this part of the plan, and where should tenants live?
This was, is this about the deductibility of mortgage interest relief and higher stamp duty? So by 2015, we were facing a problem with a limited housing supply, which we just talked about, that there were more and more second, third, fourth homes and fewer first-time buyers. And so when a new house was available or a new apartment was available, it was being bought up by someone who was building a small property portfolio for letting out. That's a perfectly reasonable business to want to construct. But when competing with, say there are 2 people competing for that house, one's a first-time buyer, wants to move in with their family, another is the person who wants to buy the house to rent it out. The tax system was hugely favouring the person who wanted to buy it to rent it out because they could deduct their mortgage interest against tax, so we were trying to basically skew the system back to being more neutral, so that a first-time buyer wasn't automatically outbid by, and the economics for the first-time buyer weren't automatically worse. I don't mean just a first-time buyer, sorry, the person buying it to be their home. It could be the third or fourth house they bought in sequence. But so that's what we sought to do. It was a deliberate attempt to give people, owner-occupiers, a bigger chance of being able to buy that property that became available.
Has it worked?
Well, I think it has actually reduced, it has skewed the house ownership back more towards owner-occupiers rather than those kind of collections of small landlord holdings. I mean, there's a kind of broader thing which I know, I'm sure you're talking about at this conference a lot, which is, a set of scandals and a set of, very legitimate concerns that people have about the quality of private rented housing leads to a whole set of obligations and campaigns. So it leads to campaigns that leads to changes of the law that says, landlords need to do this, that, and the other. They can't, and there was bad landlord practice, So you can only set a certain, there's only a fixed amount you can charge as a deposit. You can't, simply evict a tenant. You have to maintain the property to a certain condition. You have to put in a carbon monoxide alarm. Each one of which has a very strong rationale behind it, right? And we had that terrible case the other day of the poor child who died in the badly kept room with the mold and so on. But you put all those things together, as you well know better than me. If you're a sort of private independent landlord with maybe 3 apartments, that's a huge amount of legislation and compliance that you have to go through. And it basically makes it much less economic for you, much harder. Whereas a big commercial landlord will be able to, have its compliance team and its, so it is making, the collective desire in our society for more safeguards for people is making it less economic for small businesses in this space.
Well, and that goes to the follow-up by Greg, which says Section 24 forces landlords to pay tax on a loss. Do we only want landlords who can buy without a mortgage? And will this help or hinder tenants?
Yeah, so this is, again, it's basically the same answer, which is we were trying to reduce the bias in the tax system towards landlord purchases rather than owner-occupier purchases. Remember, of course, back in the 1980s, it was skewed the other way, which was that, you got MIRAS if you were buying for your own use. And then the pendulum swung the other way. Maybe the pendulum's going too far now towards the owner-occupiers, I don't know. But I think it's the accumulation of all those things I've just talked about, each one of which, is, we can totally understand why society wants to deal with these individual problems. But you put them all together and then no one, government's not very good at this. And I'd say actually, I don't think necessarily the media is very good at sort of aggregating all of these things and saying, but look at the burden we're now placing on a landlord. And I'd say, I've been an editor of a newspaper as well as being a cabinet minister. And, we did not run in the Evening Standard a load of stories about the plight of the landlord. It's much more emotional, much more connecting to the reader. It's much more relevant to most readers to do the plight of the tenant as the story. And so no one's really looking at the bigger picture of, therefore, the effect on the landlord, and particularly the smaller landlord or the independent landlord.
Some questions coming in about how many conversations government has with property experts. One question, how low must supply levels go? What must the homeless figures spike to for government to listen to the experts and revise current policy? Another one, is the government going to listen to property experts before making more decisions on the private rental sector because of Section 24? And it says you ruined it for the private rental sector. Can you give an idea to the room about the conversations that happen and how much you do listen, if at all, if you are engaging?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of conversations, and I would always, as Chancellor, but I also had a set of other ministers in the department, we would always meet with home builders, with various trade bodies, representative trade bodies. We'd talk a lot to the banks, the mortgage providers, and they often had really good information, like very immediate, up-to-date information on what was happening. So there was a lot, I certainly didn't feel like we were under-informed. The problem was we were forced to, we had to make choices that one person is not going to like the outcome of, even if the other person does. That's what politics is. It's trying to reconcile people's differences and disagreements. Now, on home building, we did skew the system in favour of additional home building. We made it harder for local councils to block it, and things like right to buy, which I introduced, were introduced precisely to kind of get the starter home market going again, which I think it did. But I promise you, I had like a lot of arguments at the time I was in a coalition government with Liberal Democrats and Conservatives who were like, hold on, you build, all your housing developments are going to get us, defeated locally by local residents groups who don't want them. I mean, the interesting thing at the moment is this government, I think correctly is trying to set these national targets, and there's a Conservative rebellion. Simple question, they could easily see off the rebellion if the Labour Party supports them. Will the Labour Party support them? Probably not, right? And with Labour Party, when you get them on, when you interview them, they'll have some like, well, we support the principle, but we don't like the way. That's rubbish. They're just, they don't want to be. They want to cause maximum trouble for the government, and they don't really care about, the house building target. So that's interestingly. I mean, if you want to get what makes life quite complicated, if you're a watcher of the Conservative Party at the moment, is there's also a rebellion underway, which Liz Truss and Boris Johnson have joined. If you want a little straw in the wind, that's trouble coming. Where they are trying to make it possible to build onshore wind turbines, which have not been built in this country since 2015. So they're saying, our green targets, renewable energy, try and bring cost of electricity down. We should have more of these onshore wind turbines, but as anyone, whoever lives near one, you'll know the local community don't like them, and they have an effect on the landscape.
Which might be changing with the energy crisis.
But that's, I would say that's a very good example of these things are not ever sort of static arguments. And suddenly, it used to be, if we were doing this conversation in Edinburgh, the Scottish government wouldn't allow any more North Sea oil exploration. And now the Scottish government doesn't dare stand in the way of it because of the cost of oil, and how it would be a good thing to have more of our own oil. So, these things do change, these arguments. They're not old arguments. I mean, they're not new arguments. The Green Belt was invented in the 1940s by the Attlee government precisely to stop the sprawl of London, as it grew and grew and grew into, what we now call the sort of London suburbs. And, so there was clearly, even 70 years ago, they were kind of debating it. And, there've been all sorts of arguments about listed buildings and lines of sight and all that kind of stuff, which you'll be very familiar with, or many will be. What I always think is interesting is there aren't very many new arguments in politics. You'll find often there's a reason why the country hasn't agreed on a sort of settled way forward, because there's a genuine disagreement.
What about taking it out of political hands? Here's a question. Should there be an apolitical OBR-style agency to deliver housing strategy with better planning decisions, removing the need for poor local planning authorities?
Well, I think that is actually...
Does that work?
Well, it might well work. Quite often when politicians have to take really unpopular decisions, they quite often create an independent body to take them for them.
Is that what you did?
Which we did with, yes, I guess with the OBR, that was, let them make the forecast and then get asked by Naga whether the forecast is right, other than let the Chancellor do it. Most famous one being interest rates, really unpopular to increase interest rates, but someone's got to do it. And so it's not just blame shifting, it's also that, an independent central bank is not subject to all those pressures. Tory and Labour chancellors used to announce interest rates cuts in their conference speeches as a kind of popular thing to announce.
But this is an easy way out, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Well, the only thing is you'd have to have the politicians collectively agree that this is the best way of doing something that's necessary. So if you manage to get all the politicians to agree, which I think broadly they do, that's why I think it's an interesting idea, that we do need more homes.
There is a housing crisis.
Yeah, then, let someone else decide where they go. And that sort of is what we've, had with things like planning inspectorates and so on. I mean, there's another sort of parallel with this, which is infrastructure. So, I was the person who gave the go-ahead to the Elizabeth line 12 years ago and started HS2. And So first was, there was a lot of opposition to Crossrail, as it was then called. Now everyone's like, oh, brilliant, Elizabeth line, right? So once it's sort of, and I would predict the same thing is going to happen to HS2. Obviously, at the moment, the only people who care about HS2, understandably, are people who live where the route's going and are very upset about it. And it went through my constituency. It was very angry meetings, like rooms like this, people shouting at me, saying, how can you have supported this? But I predict once it's open, everyone's going to go, oh, bloody brilliant, look, you can get to Manchester in an hour. And so these infrastructure projects are hugely contested at the time. The M25 was bitterly fought by every single one of those towns around London, whether it was Crawley or Hemel Hempstead or wherever, they were all against it. The Channel Tunnel, bitterly opposed by the community in Folkestone. The fast HS1, there's a reason why it's called HS2, HS1, which is the fast line through Kent, the Javelin line, every single Kent community, like Margate, opposed it. Now they'll go, it's brilliant, you can go to Margate in like half an hour. So these infrastructure projects are really objected to, and governments have created things like Infrastructure Commission and sort of independent kind of bodies to try and insulate themselves from the kind of political heat they get, because the political incentives are very poor. You're never going to see this project open during your time, but it's kind of the right thing to do. And that, how you sort of square that circle in a democracy is like a hard thing.
Great. Am I seeing any hands up? I'm seeing one here. We've got 17 minutes. So gentleman here, would you mind giving your name and your question? Thank you.
Yeah, no, my name's Max, and I work for a company called Rentancy. I just wondered what your opinion was on banks buying up more and more stock. We've got Lloyds, for example, by 2025. They're targeting about 50,000 houses, and I just wondered basically what your opinion is on financial institutions and, banks buying stock.
It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I'm going to have a strong opinion either way. I think, you might find it tails off. Obviously, we've lived through this period of very low interest rates where any financial institution that was trying to return money to its investors couldn't just buy British government bonds or US Treasury bonds. And we all know, if you've got any money in the bank, that you're getting nothing really from your savings. So that drove the entire industry, the finance industry, as you well know, into looking for what they would call alternatives, or illiquid investments, i.e. housing, infrastructure, things that would deliver a better yield regularly over time. All that is unwinding. Now you can get, if you went to buy US government bonds, you get 4%. So you can get, you can get much better yields on safe government debt. And that is what's caused this enormous convulsion in the financial market. That's what led to the implosion of those pension funds a few weeks ago, which the Bank of England had to step in to rescue. That's what's led to the collapse in the value of these tech stocks. Because if you can get the safe money from the US Treasury, you don't have to take the riskier bet on the tech company growing really fast. It's one of the reasons why all the crypto markets have collapsed as well. So I would imagine that will start to have an effect. People say, well, rather than building up my housing portfolio, I don't need to do that to get the yield, and I can do sort of safer investments in government bonds.
Any other questions on the floor? Excellent. So we've got a hand here and we've got two hands here, spotted you, and one down the front. In the middle there, purple tie. So I've got 15 minutes, so George, would you mind keeping your answers short, and then I can get through everyone? Great. Your name, please.
Hello, Greg Suman. Thank you very much for being so open with us. And I think your 2015 policy had an integral assumption that there would be considerable house building and targets being met. We now know that that didn't happen for a number of reasons you've already touched on.
Yeah.
Section 24 is causing an enormous upheaval with double-digit rental growth. Is there a way that you would recommend that we can lobby the government to reverse Section 24 and the additional stamp duty?
Great. Would you mind passing the microphone on to the lady next to you? Thank you.
Just on the, shall I answer specifically on additional stamp duty? Because I think I haven't actually addressed that. In Britain, you will know, Britain has very low property taxes. In the United States, in New York or Los Angeles, you have to pay roughly 1% of your value of your house every year in property tax. And it's even more in continental Europe. We don't have that at all. If you go down the road not far from here, there's a road called Kensington Palace Gardens, which is known affectionately as Millionaires Row, but it is actually now Billionaires Row. And, the likes of Roman Abramovich have a house there and so on. And these houses are worth like 150 million, 200 million pounds. They pay £2,000 council tax to Kensington Chelsea Council, right? That's all they pay. Now, and we are very wedded to that system. You try and be the politician who gets up and proposes a mansion tax, right, as various people have tried over the last 15 years. And as a result, what I did and what others have done in my job has said, okay, well, we can't get away with doing a kind of annual tax. We'll basically pile the money on when you buy the property, stamp duty. Now, I personally would have preferred additional council tax bans rather than higher stamp duty. But the political coalition I was in, Liberal, Democrat, as well as Conservative, was like, we're not doing that. So that's why stamp duty roughly equates to 7 or 8 years worth of annual property tax for a more expensive house. And that's sort of how we worked it out, because that was roughly how long people lived in houses. It was as straightforward as that.
Hello.
Hello, my name's Eileen. I'm from Red Squirrel Property Shop on the Isle of Wight. Basically, I was going to say exactly the same as the gentleman, but especially about the Section 24.
Yeah.
And it's just really an observation. If you could speak to like estate agents and letting agents up and down the country, because we are on the front line, we hear everything from the landlords and the tenants.
Yeah.
And definitely on the Isle of Wight, we have a housing crisis. We have a school. Our schools are full capacity, and it's impossible to get in to have operations. I was meant to have an operation in May. It's still cancelled till after in January. So we've only got one hospital on the island. We need another hospital. We need more schools.
What's your question?
But it is just about the Section 24, sorry. And it was to say that if you're going to listen to the estate agents and letting agents to get all, so you know what tenants are going through and landlords.
So that they don't feel listened to by you or the government.
They don't. No.
Yeah, I think, I thought the Isle of Wight is a perfect example, right? Lots of people want to live on the Isle of Wight because it's a beautiful place to live. If you live on the Isle of Wight at the moment, you don't want any more homes built. Or if you do want homes built, you want them for your children, right? There's a big thing which is let's keep the homes for islanders, right? Which means sort of restricting who can buy particular properties. And then you get all the argument of the pressure on public services. And that is in a microcosm. And if you wanted to be the MP for the Isle of Wight, woe betide you got up and tried to say, well, I think we should build a load more homes in the Isle of Wight. And that is a kind of microcosm. It happens to be one of the most attractive places in Britain to live, and a load of people want to live there. And that drives property prices up. There's no support for local house building. There's opposition locally to second homeowners and let accommodation for holidays and so on. And so that, I would say demonstrates everything I've been talking about, the very hard political pressures in a democracy against solving that problem from local people who don't want more homes built, and don't want more landlords, and don't want more holiday lets, and don't want more second homeowners, and therefore, that's why politicians end up doing things like putting additional charges on stamp duty, precisely to align with what those local desires are. Gentleman over there.
Hi, cheers, George. My name's Simon. I'm a bitter Romaniac, and I'm not going to let it go. Often, whenever you try to talk about the whole Brexit kerfuffle, you can't talk about anything without it having Project Fear thrown back in your face. You were clearly shown as the main proponent, the main pusher of that. Do you feel any regret over that, or is there anything you would have done differently to try and, in hindsight, change that whole direction of conversation?
You look like you're dressed on the Italian Riviera.
Sorry, whoever next had a question, would they raise their hand?
Yeah.
Great.
So a short answer. By the way, lots of people would disagree with what I'm about to say, so I will flag it in advance. First of all, the thing to do was not to have had a referendum. Once you had a referendum, I don't think Project Fear reduced the vote for the EU, right? as it was called, Project Fear. Because what we discovered, and it maybe, this was a collective failing of the government I was part of, me, and indeed I would say the political classes, left and right, was that there were no real arguments. People did not feel an emotional attachment to being in the EU. They didn't buy the security argument of why it was safer for our world that there was an EU. They didn't buy all these kind of arguments about how it was good to be able to travel and study abroad and work abroad and all that. The one thing that was holding more people back from voting leave was a concern about the economic consequences. And so our campaign tried these other things, and they didn't work. Obviously, the other side were going on immigration, take back control, and so on. And the one thing that was working for us in holding some votes that would otherwise go leave was concern about the cost, the impact on the economy, and so on. And I stand by the projections we made. There's a Treasury document you can get out, which is still on the website, called the Medium-Term Forecast for Brexit, Medium-Term Consequences of Leaving the EU. It is spot on 6 years later. It is all the projections that were made then in that medium-term forecast document are very similar to the ones we were talking about, similar at the beginning of this interview. That not that Britain would be sort of in absolute terms poorer. It's just not as rich as it would be inside the EU. And this, you can see it in the way that some of the financial services have left this country. You've seen it in the way that car production has completely collapsed in this country since Brexit because you can't export the cars easily to the continent and so on. So that there was a document. But I regret the whole having a referendum. I very much regret we didn't win. But I don't regret essentially trying to tell people what the economic consequences were. Not that in the end people believed me enough. And
next question.
Hello.
Your name?
My name is Richard, and I live and work in the West Country in Devon. You mentioned in an earlier answer the second home ownership, and clearly that is an issue down with us as it makes local housing unaffordable for a lot of people. Do you think the tax system could be changed further than the stamp duty changes you brought in to make that easier for people to own a house in the West Country?
Well, first of all, I have a second home in the West Country, so I need to be extremely careful about what I say. In Somerset, not in Devon. So I think we've. I mean, by the way, this is interesting because this is the other point of view, right? Which is, make it harder for people to have second homes or multiple, a small landlord holdings. And what we've done is, so there's an additional stamp duty charge for buying the home. We've removed the tax relief you get. There are things like, there are additional council tax charges for vacant properties and the like. I don't think within the existing system there's much more you could do. You could introduce a property tax like most other Western countries have, but I don't think there's any political consensus for that. I'm skeptical of trying to tie the ownership of houses to local people, because I think that gets very bureaucratic, real intervention in people's property and what they own. And also you kind of quite quickly, after one or two generations would sort of start to lose the thread on that and like whether. I'm personally, I was always a bit skeptical of, when they try and reserve housing for key workers. That kind of works it's a good thing to announce with a housing development, we're going to reserve a certain amount of housing for key workers. But, so then the nurse buys the house. And
if she earns enough.
If she earns enough. And then she or he wants to sell the house 10 years later. Can they only then sell to another nurse or police officer or fireman? You're actually making that nurse poorer than they would otherwise be because they can't maximize the number of people who could buy that property. So I thought those were basically the wrong kind of solution. And so I think this kind of tying local properties to local residents doesn't work. I know it's a big issue in Devon and even more so in Cornwall.
Hi, this is Sachin Gupta from 99 Home. My question is regarding the latest topic that landlords are exiting from the market and our business purely survive on the landlords specifically. So my question to you is what your views are there is a lot of crisis, there are a lot of demotivation to the landlord, as we all discuss Section 24 and other things. I like to know from you that is that government doing anything, or can you suggest to the government, as you know, in a powerful position, that something can be done for the landlords to motivate, to retain in the market, or that can be some kind of good news towards the landlords, because end of the day is going to the industry to survive. So I'd like to know your view on that.
Well, I mean, I think, very briefly, I could tell you something you'll want to hear, which is, yes, the government will definitely do something for landlords, but the answer is they won't. So I think you'd much rather have it straight. The truth is, the political calculation at the moment by the government and indeed the opposition is, we've got to be on the side of the increasing number of people in this country who rent. And of course, there are very many more people who rent than people who let. So that's why, I think you'll get the housing bill back on the agenda. I know it was scrapped under the sort of brief trust period, but now it's going to come back, and I think you will have things like scrapping the Section 21s, orders and so on. The one thing, of course, that's doing wonders for landlords is the rapidly rising rents that all of this is causing, and the costs, which of course are falling on tenants. Here in London, I know particularly, there's enormous pressure on rents, and so there are some economic incentives that are working in favour of landlords.
Gentleman over there.
Hi, George. Thank you for your insights. It's been really interesting today.
Your name?
Gareth. I've spent 20, 30 years in the industry. We talked about lack of stock. We've talked about poor quality housing. We've talked about rising rents. And what made me think, if you go back before your government, so in the Mrs. Thatcher's government and the sell-off of the council houses, do you think there's anything looking back that has contributed to some of these factors?
I don't think the sale of council houses did, because that did give people the chance who would never otherwise have had it to own their own property. It led to a kind of revolution in the creation of all these social housing associations, and not that many councils now own large council holdings on their property holdings on their own books. The solution, let's end on a more optimistic note. You can see dramatic changes and improvements in housing. When I was a child, the city centres of the great cities outside London were desolate. They were really difficult places that had been in decline for 50 years, and a combination, and it was also true in East London as well. I remember going around the docks with my mother when I was about 7 or 8, and wasteland. Now East London's booming. Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, the city centres have revived. There's an enormous number of people come back to living in the city centres. And an amazing fact, but only about 3 years ago, I think it was, just before COVID in 2019, London, for the first time since this, had a population that was the same as it had had in 1939. In other words, it had declined all that time and was only... So, good policy, the right infrastructure, the right framework for encouraging house building has led to an enormous renovation and rejuvenation of our city centres. There isn't a solution at the moment to the kind of Isle of Wight problem, which is this is where people want to live, but it's already very crowded, and the people who live there feel that additional homes would place too many burdens on public services and destroy the local environment. And we don't really have a solution to that at the moment, and that's why it's so politically contentious.
Okay, quick fire round. I've got 4 minutes. This is from me. Okay. Rent controls, are there going to be any? They exist in Scotland, in the rest of the UK.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think if there is a Labour government, which, as I say, I think is more likely than not, I think they will do more and more for renters, and you could see forms of rent control.
Under a Labour government?
Yes.
Not.
Of course, the Mayor of London wants to introduce freezers and so on rents,
Definitely not under a Conservative government.
I would think unlikely, but possible.
Okay. Scottish independence, will it happen in the next 10 years?
I think not. I'm rather optimistic about that. I just think that every time the kind of nationalists kind of try and get the whatever the ball up the hill, it doesn't quite get there. People don't really want it. They like the idea, but when they're confronted with the realities, and interestingly, they have an economic argument. Sorry, the unionists, the people who want Scotland to remain, have an economic argument we never had with the EU, which is you really would be poorer if you left because your mortgage would be denominated in pounds and your income would be in whatever the Scottish currency would be, and so you wouldn't be able to afford your mortgage or your small business loan.
How many Conservatives will lose their job in 2024?
I don't know. There'll definitely be some, because I think it's highly unlikely the Tories will retain...
Conservative MPs, I should say.
Yeah. I don't know. I think a couple of months ago it was looking like a landslide, but, Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, they look quite a sort of safe pair of hands. And if the Labour Party, all they offer is a safe pair of hands, it won't be as big it might be a Labour win, but it won't be a landslide.
Give me a number.
The trouble is I've got to then work out in my head how many there are at the moment, and I don't know. What is it,
366 or something?
Yeah, I don't know. I would, you've got to think that the most likely outcome is a Labour majority of, let me say, 30.
Will Dominic Raab be one of them? There's a third formal complaint that's gone in.
I don't know. The short answer, I don't know, but I know that by hand, there's a reason why Prime Ministers don't want to kind of give this power to independent adjudicators. I think he's also quite possibly might lose his own seat. He's under a lot of pressure locally. So if the independent adjudicator don't get him, maybe the voter will.
I hate to announce this to the room. Wales has lost to Iran. 2-0. England versus the USA this evening.
But does that mean it's more likely that England goes through?
Well, no, England... well, come on. This is 4 nations, 1 UK. Score prediction, England versus the USA this evening.
2-1. I'm a Chelsea supporter, so I think Christian Pulisic might score. But I think England look like they're... I know, we always say this, but maybe it's coming home.
Ever a politician. Have you voted for Matt Hancock to do any trials in I'm a Celebrity?
So I know we're running out of time, but I am responsible for Matt Hancock. I created Matt Hancock.
Wow, that's a big thing to admit to in this room.
So when I was Shadow Chancellor, I made Shadow Chancellor, and I only had one person working for me who was my brilliant person, secretary, so personal assistant in the House of Commons. I was the Shadow Chancellor, and I was introduced at a drinks event to this young guy who was a Bank of England economist. Pretty impressive. And if you're a Shadow Chancellor, you need help. And it was young Matthew Hancock who said he was in his 20s and he was interested in trying to become a Conservative. He was thinking of leaving the Bank of England and trying to get into politics. Said, you've got to come and work for me. And I said at the time, this was when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, I said, you could be my Ed Balls. That was my appeal. Ed Balls was Gordon's advisor at the time. And of course, I didn't mean he'd sort of take it so literally that he'd then follow him into reality television and all this later. But I will give you a prediction, which is when he went into the jungle, everyone was outraged and he's whatever. Now, he's doing quite well, isn't he? And they're having quite a lot of votes where he's not the one being voted out. And, maybe he's going to win it. And I think he carries a lot of stick for the kind of decisions on COVID that basically had to be made. And obviously there was, the affair and everything. But the thing that people are really angry about... but that was, to my mind, why were people so angry? They were angry because there was a lot of people who were against all those COVID restrictions, and he was seen as the kind of poster child for them. I would only say that in a room with like Boris Johnson and some of the other people who used to work for Boris, Matthew Hancock was like one of the sensible voices who'd actually read up on the thing before the meeting.
Did you vote for him for any trials?
I haven't actually voted for anyone, so.
And would you do it?
I would if you gave me the number that I need to text.
I can give you the number. Would you go into the jungle?
Oh, would I go? No. I've no. I've thankfully not reached that point in my career.
George Osborne, former Chancellor, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Stay there for a moment.